Welcome to the next video in the Suggestion App course. This is a complete course where we'll build a .NET 6 Blazor server application with MongoDB from the ground up. There are three things you need to know before we get started. First, this is part of a series, and this isn't the first video in the series. If you're just starting out, you should check out the playlist that's linked in the description to start from the first video in the series. Second, this course is actually a paid course. MongoDB sponsored it so you can put the videos on YouTube for free. Check out the link in the description to sign up for MongoDB Atlas for free to thank them if you haven't already. Third, you can also buy this course on imtimcorey.com. The link is in the description. Buying this course will get you all the lessons right away, the source code for each lesson, a certificate of completion, offline access, and more. It also helps sponsor more free content. The video will be the same as it is on YouTube, so feel free to watch the free version if you want to. Okay, let's jump into today's video. Note there may be more than one lesson in this video, since some lessons are short. Now it's time to add our user flows. Now a user flow, there's three different flows we're going to add, and they are essentially for creating the pages necessary for a user to go through a few steps. The first one will be sign up and sign in, where we're going to present them a page that says, hey, go ahead and log in or create your login if you don't have one yet. And if they click create, it's going to come with a page that has a form that asks for certain information. And then once they confirm and validate, then we're going to allow them to sign in with that information. That's the sign up, sign in flow. Then we'll have a flow for editing their information where they've already signed up and signed in, but now they want to make a change. Maybe their display name is incorrect, maybe a typo, something of that nature. Well, they can come in and edit that information and update their account. And the final one will be a password reset, where maybe they forgot their password, and so we have a flow for allowing them to reset that password. Those are user flows, and they're independent of the app registration. So we'll create user flows down here, where the user flow will be for the entire B2C, and it will not be just for this one suggestion site. Now, we could create identity experience framework, which is basically like the more expanded, more complex way of doing user flows. User flows are very, very simple and very powerful, easy to use, and quick to set up. We're going to go that route instead. We're going to go the quick route, not the complex route. So we have three flows to create. The first one is sign up and sign in, not just sign up and not just sign in. We're not going to do these. We're going to do the first three, sign up and sign in, profile editing, and password reset. So sign up, sign in, and yes, the recommended version. So we need to give this a name. Now, the name starts off, and actually, let's see if I can zoom in on this page. Ooh, I can. Nice. So the name starts off with B2C_1_, and we give it a name. And this just uniquely identifies your flow, since we'll need to know all three of these flows to name them in our application and say, hey, use this flow for our application. So the default naming for sign up, sign in is SUSI, S-U-S-I, for sign up, sign in. We'll just choose to use the standard convention here. Next, identity provider. We're going to choose just local accounts with email sign up. We could add other identity providers. For example, we could say, hey, you know what? We're going to allow Twitter authentication or Facebook authentication or Microsoft account authentication. Instead of just create a new account, you can use an existing account with a different provider. We're not going to enable that, but that is definitely possible, not hard to do. Next, we have multi-factor authentication, and that is off. So we could enable multi-factor authentication, and then we could choose email, SMS, or phone, and so on. We're not going to do that because of the fact that it is an added expense to do SMS or phone. We could do email as a multi-factor authentication, but I don't think it's necessary for this type of site. So we're not going to enforce multi-factor authentication. And then as far as conditional access policies go, we could check this to enable conditional access policies and enforce grants like multi-factor authentication. We're not going to do that. We're just going to allow people to sign up or not. We're not going to worry about giving them conditional access based upon whether or not they have multi-factor authentication or other type of settings. Okay, user claims and token claims. We want to do a show more here since it only shows the first 5. The show more is going to show all of them. Notice the scroll here. And there's 2 different columns. One is what we collect and one is what we return. This is important because when you collect something, you're asking the user for that information. So if I said collect city, then that would be asking the user what their city is, and they would be able to provide that information. I don't need to collect that. And in fact, I don't need to know that. And so I'm going to try not to ask for things that I don't need to know. Now, if I said, hey, return that, what it would do is return the city in the token when they log in. But if I never ask for it, it's going to return null because it doesn't know what the city is. It can't guess. So we'd have to collect it if we wanted to return it. Now, again, country region, not going to collect that. I am going to collect display name and return it because this is the name that you're going to display to the world when you create a suggestion. So it could be your first name space your last name. So it could be just Tim Corey, for my name, but maybe it's something more obscure or something like, Dark Rider 123. Sure, whatever. Don't really care. But that would then be your display name. Okay. And it's associated with your account, but it's something you can show to the world that might not give away your identity in a way that a first or last name otherwise would. Now, we can collect the email address. So we can collect the email address, but we're not going to return it. Notice a grayed out box here. We're going to return email addresses. All right. So this says, hey, collect the email address, but return all their email addresses. Now, next up is given name, otherwise known as first name. I'm going to ask for that. Identity provider, we're not going to ask for that. That would be if you're using like Twitter and Facebook and local. We'd know which provider you're logging in through. We are going to ask for the user's object ID, so we're not going to ask for identity provider access token. That'd be different. Now, the one more thing we're going to ask for, but not ask the user to fill in, is job title. So we're not going to let the user fill that in. They can't choose what their job title is, but we are going to ask for it. And the reason for this is because we're going to use job title to identify if you're an admin. So we'll see how to do that in a little bit, but this is something that we'll have to manually modify on the server. As an owner of the B2C directory, I can go in and mark people as admin. That's it. No one else can do that. So that's how we're going to use B2C to provide some level of authorization level. Now, normally B2C, it's an even playing field. Everyone is the same. Everyone's just a user. But with this little tweak, we can kind of get around that and add a little bit of a role-based thing to our B2C user. We're not going to write age group classification, postal code, state, street. We are going to ask for a surname and collect that. We will capture if the user is new and their object ID. Notice we can't modify those. We can't ask the user for those. So the user's new, that's if they just signed up. That will come back on a token. We could use that for something like if we wanted to do a tutorial where the first time you log in with an account, we say, hey, we see you're new. Can we show you around? And we wouldn't keep bugging the person because once they've logged in a second time, it wouldn't say they're new anymore. Therefore, we wouldn't show that tutorial. That can be a nice way to go about that. And then finally, the user's object ID. This is the identifier that Azure Active Directory B2C will give the user. It's unique to the user. It will not change. And that identifies them and says, this is this person. That way, even if they change their display name, their first name or last name, and their email address, it's okay. The object ID is still the same. We hit OK. And we've now created our first, once you hit create, our first user flow. That's for sign up and sign in. Once that flow gets created, we can come back here and say new user flow, profile editing. We say yes, the recommended version. We hit create. And this is going to be, again, a standard name is edit. For email sign-in, we're not going to do multi-factor. We're not going to do conditional. And just like before, we have the collect and return. So let's do show more. And you may say, well, why is the same thing happening over again? Well, this is for allowing a user to modify. So we're going to return their email addresses, but not allow them to modify it. They can't modify their email address once they use it. They can modify a display name. We will return that value as well. Given name, we'll let them modify it. Not their job title, but we will return it. And then their surname or their last name. And yes, we're returning their object ID again. We hit OK, and this is the edit flow. We have one more flow to do, and that is the password reset flow. Yes, the recommended. And we'll call this reset. Reset password using email address. So if they forget their password, it's going to email them a link and say, hey, use this link to reset your password. And then return claims, since they're not modifying anything, they're just resetting their password. Yes, we're going to return things, but there's no modification here. So display name, email addresses, given name, job title, surname, and object ID. We hit OK. We hit create. And now we have our 3 different user flows for our application. This will create those login pages that we'll see in a little bit. It will allow it'll know the process to go through so the user fills their information in it, knows what to do next, and so on. So with these, we're now done our user flows. We can go on to now configure our application to use this registration and these user flows. Now we have our Azure Active Directory set up. We can go over to our code and modify our app settings to use this information. Now, don't shut down your website or your browser. We'll need to have access to a lot of data in there. So in our appsettings.json, I want you to put a comma, and then we're going to create a whole site or a whole section dedicated to Azure Active Directory. So we'll call this Azure ADB2C. You can call this anything you want. That's pretty much the standard for it. And we'll have a bunch of things in here. Instance. And then we'll have our client ID. And yes, these are standard names, so don't change these names. Callback path. And the callback path is always going to be /signin-OIDC. That sound familiar? That was the extension we added on the end of our localhost URL. And then we have domain. We're going to come back through and fill these in, by the way. And then we have our sign up, sign in policy ID. Be very careful you type this out correctly. A mistyped entry here, since it is just string as text, that will cause a misalignment and you will have a problem with your application. B2C_1_Susie. That's the name I gave it. And then we have our reset password policy ID. And that's B2C_1_reset. And again, a lesson learned here is make sure that you name things properly so they match up. I had a problem where my names were backwards in B2C, and so when I put them in here, they matched up properly, but they were wrong. I had to change the names in B2C to match up where they should be because it caused all kinds of problems. It wouldn't work. Edit profile policy ID, and that is B2C_1_edit. So those are the sections we need, but we need to find out what instance, client ID, and domain are. So let's go back to our page here, and let's go to app registrations, and we're going to go to owned applications, Timco suggestion site. And here we have application in parentheses client ID. So this is one of those cases again where Microsoft said, hey, let's give these things different names because that'll be fun. This is the client ID. That's what's called in C#, but in the portal it's called application ID. So they put client in parentheses just so we know it's the same thing. Copy that to clipboard and then go back to here and get our client ID and paste that in. So there we go. There's our client ID. Let's go back to Azure. And this time we're going to go, instead of the Timco suggestion site, we're going to go to the root of Azure Active Directory B2C and go to the overview. And here we have domain name. Copy this. And then come back over here in instance, we're going to put https://, paste in our domain name, put a slash at the end. And then for domain, it's just the raw version of that. So paste that in a second time. So that is the settings we need for our Azure Active Directory. Now you may say, hey Tim, you're showing this off on camera. Isn't that your personal one? And yes, it is. But first of all, please don't use it. Second of all, I'm going to delete it, so it shouldn't be there anymore. And third of all, you have to have the callback URLs in place, otherwise it won't work for your site. So the most you could do is spoof the local host setup, and that'd be it. Okay, so that is our settings for our appsettings.json file. You need to have these in place in order to talk to your Azure Active Directory B2C. Now let's configure our program.cs file to use authentication. So after use routing, let's put some space and say app.use authentication and authorization. Authentication comes first, and then we have use authorization. So authentication first and then authorization. Remember, authentication is where you log in. Authorization is where you have permission or not to certain resources. So that's the difference there. Okay, so that's all we need to do to modify our program.cs to utilize our site. And that's because we've already added, if you go back to our file here, we add these two packages, Microsoft.identity.web and Microsoft.identity.web.ui. These two packages were added and they support authentication in our system. So we had to have those first, but now you can just say, hey, yep, go ahead and use that for authentication. Now that we have authentication and authorization in place, we need to modify our dependency injection to add additional things. So what we're going to do is say builder.services, not add MVC, .AddAuthentication. And we're going to say it's the OpenID connect defaults, control dot to add a using statement there. And it's .authentication scheme. And then we're going to, on a new line here, say dot add Microsoft identity web app. Again, control dot to add a using statement. And then we'll say builder dot configuration dot get section Azure AD B2C. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we're adding our authentication system, and we're saying use the Microsoft Identity Web App authentication system, and we're passing in this right here. So what's builder.configuration? Well, that's how we talk to our appsettings.json while we're configuring our application. So it knows about appsettings.json. We can say get section. In the section, Azure AD B2C. That matches up with Azure AD B2C. So it's going to get this whole section of information. And from there, it can pull out the various pieces it needs. And it's going to put that into our Identity Web App, which is going to register our authentication system properly with the right stuff in our B2C. So everything should be set up now for the initial stuff, but we're going to do one more thing. I'm going to separate this out into a different video, and that is we're going to add in that admin policy. The admin policy is basically a bonus here because that's not normally what we do with Azure Active Directory B2C. We don't normally have different roles, but we're going to show you how to do an admin policy here because we're going to use it. So in our dependency injection, we're going to say builder.services.AddAuthentication, not authentication, authorization. And we're going to say options. And we'll have an arrow. Nope. Options. There's the arrow. And then let's do curly braces on the new line. And we'll say options.addPolicy. This policy we'll call the admin policy. And the policy, again, arrow function, and more curly braces, we'll say policy.requireClaim job title, capitalization is important here, admin. And we'll put our semicolons on all three lines here to make it happy. So what this is doing is create a new policy. We can check policies whenever we go to a page. We can say, hey, do you have this policy? So the policy name is admin. We can name that whatever we want. But I'm going to call it admin because that's what it is. I call it administrative. I call it whatever I want. But again, I'll call it admin. The policy directive says in order to have this policy applied to you, that you're an admin, we're going to require that you have a specific claim. Remember, when you log in, it sends down a bunch of information back. So it sends back the information like your given name and your surname and your display name and your email addresses if this is your first time using the application, and so on. And one of those claims will be job title. Remember we said send down the job title, but don't allow the user to modify it? So that's what's coming down as job title. And we require that job title claim has to have a value of admin. So if we put in the job title admin, then that user will be an administrator. If we don't put admin in the job title, they will not be an administrator. So that is the authorization policy. So we're going to use this to verify if they're allowed to go to the admin approval page. This page, we're going to say, hey, not only do you have to be authenticated, you also have to be authorized. You have to be an admin. So we'll check for the admin policy. So that's how we're going to add the admin policy in order to do a check for your authorization level. Now let's modify the redirect for when you log out. Normally when you log out, you go to a page that says, hey, you've been signed out. That's not ideal for me. I want to go back to the home page. Let's go to program.cs, and after we have our use authorization statement, we're going to add app.useRewriter. And we'll open our parens, and then we're going to go on a new line and say new rewriter or rewrite options, which it's going to want me to do this. So let's take off all of this, and we'll do a control dot to add a using statement. I wish it would default to that. And rewrite options, and it's a new rewrite options dot add, and we'll open parens again. And in here, we'll say context arrow curly braces, and we're going to say if context.http context.request.path equals, and here's the path is going to be Microsoft identity /account /signed out. This is what you'll go to normally if you try to sign out of our site. But we're going to say, hey, wait, if you see that this path is being attempted, meaning you're trying to go to this path, then instead, I want you to say context.http context.response.redirect. I want you to redirect to the home page, which is just /. So what that will do, we'll put our semicolon at the very end. What this will do is it will ensure that instead of going to this page, which is a very boring white page that says you've been signed out, instead we'll go to the home page. So that is the rewriter for our sign out policy. Before we can use the authentication in our application, we need to modify our App.razor page. Let's go to App.razor, and in here we have the routing, but this routing needs to pass in our authentication to say, hey, this is who is logged in or not. So let's cut this all out for now. Just Control X, then say CascadingAuthenticationState, and then paste it back in. So now we have let's tab over so we have the right tabbing here. So we have CascadingAuthenticationState, which wraps everything, and then we have our router like normal, which is going to load up our app. And then from there, we have the found context. Now, inside the found context, we're going to modify this stuff right here. So let's make some tweaks here. We're going to wrap this right here. Let's cut it out, actually. Well, we'll just change it. So let's change this to authorize route view instead of route view. So now it's authorized route view. It still has the route data and the default layout, but now we need to take off the self-closing tag, go to the next line and close it out. And then we'll fix the formatting. And then inside of here, what this does is it's going to check to see if this is an authorized route and if you're authorized to go there. And if you're not, we need to have a not authorized section. This will be where we send the user or what we show the user if they're not authorized. Now we could just put a message in here. We could just put an H2 and say not authorized, etc. But we've already made an adjustment here where we have the not authorized page, or actually object. That's this not authorized right here that says, hey, you're not authorized, and so on. We have closed and all the rest. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to redirect them to that page and say, show this page if you're not authorized to go to the route you requested. So with that, we can come down here and look, we don't have anything else to really change. We do have the not found, which we can modify that as well. Right now it just says, hey, there's nothing at this address. If we wanted to, we could change that to something like another page like this, or we could, further expand what's shown here. But for right now, we're going to leave that alone. So that's the modifications to the App.razor that will send us to the not authorized page if we go to a page and we're not logged in.